Part 79, Regent Prince, I'm not leaving. I'll be with you for the rest of my life. Along the way, he could see many subordinates pointing at him, and he didn't need to listen carefully. And he knew that they were talking behind his back that he was a fox spirit who had cultivated in the mountains for thousands of years. In other words, if he was really a fox spirit who had cultivated for thousands of years, then he would have already soared through the clouds and flew back to the Holy Dynasty. Shaking his head, he came to Baiming Qianyu's room, only to see that Baiming Qianyu had already gotten out of bed. He was just about to step forward to ask, but was hugged by Baiming Qianyu. And there was a deep magnetic voice from Baiming Qianyu in his ears. Why did you come so late today? Junhua didn't answer, but said something else. Prince, I have something to say. He grabbed his restless hand and decided to talk about this matter with Baiming Qianyu today. If he was allowed to develop, he would definitely be pushed to the fire by Baiming Qianyu. I'm listening? Baiming Qianyu broke free from Junhua's clamps and went directly into Junhua's clothes. Junhua was quite speechless. This person was injured and not healed yet, so he wanted to have sex? Ahem. This is not the point. Now the focus is to persuade Baiming Qianyu not to forget Mrs. Shui and others. He coughed lightly and said slowly, Prince, you haven't been to the courtyard of Mrs. Shui and Mrs. Ru for a long time. If you are unwell, you can let them come over to chat with you to relieve your boredom. Ziqing, what if you're not angry with me? Baiming Qianyu used force in his hand and hugged the person in his arms tightly. But he obviously hugged the person in his arms tightly, but he still felt very ethereal, as if the person in his arms would disappear at any time. It made him panic. Prince, do you think about me? Junhua didn't want to say this clearly, but if he didn't say it clearly, Baiming Qianyu seemed to never understand his current situation. Ziqing, if I hadn't thought about you, I wouldn't have cared about your life or death a long time ago. Baiming Qianyu was a little angry. He was afraid that the remarks in the house would hurt Junhua. So he hurriedly asked people to investigate the matter thoroughly, and now he has found out who is spreading rumors. As long as he is tortured and asked, he can always ask who is the mastermind of this matter. But Junhua solved the matter and wanted him to cater to those concubines. If you really think about me, you should meet Mrs. Shui and the others. As long as you know how to get wet with rain and dew, I won't have any trouble. Although Junhua was calm on the surface, a trace of pain rose in his heart. Thinking of Baiming Qianyu and others entangled, he was so sad that he had some difficulty breathing. Baiming Qianyu pushed Junhua away, looked directly at Junhua's deep eyes, and asked in a cold voice, I'm looking for another woman, don't you really care? Junhua looked at the sadness in Baiming Qianyu's eyes, and his heart trembled, but he still nodded stiffly. Hey Tilda, Baiming Qianyu sneered. What kind of thing did he like, so unintentional and ruthless? Seeing that the other party was angry, Junhua said kindly, Prince, it is very common for a man to have 3 wives and 4 concubines. Before he finished speaking, Baiming Qianyu was emotional, and directly roared angrily, Shen Li, are you blind? I treat you sincerely. Can't you really see it? Prince, actually, I don't mind. He said he didn't mind, but how could he not mind? He is also a man, and his possessiveness is no less than that of Baiming Qianyu. You don't mind if you don't love. Baiming Qianyu, who came to this conclusion, covered his chest with pain, his blood surged, and he roared, Get out! You get out of this, Prince! The wound on his body that was about to heal burst open with too much excitement, and blood flowed out, staining the white and flawless gorgeous robe on his body red. Junhua looked at the red blood on his robe, which stinged his eyes. He hurriedly opened his eyes, and turned away ruthlessly. Ahem. Baiming Qianyu hung his head and coughed violently. And the coughing sound tore at the wound on his body, making his face pale in pain. Raising his eyes to look at the back of the resolute departure, and roared, "Shen Li. Do you really like to be Fubai so much?" Junhua didn't look back. Because there are some things that have to go on since the decision has been made. And turning back halfway not only hurts Baiming Qianyu, but also hurts himself. Luju saw Junhua come back. Her face was full of surprise. She hurriedly greeted Junhua. Seeing that Junhua was pale and his eyes were blank, she was startled, and asked with concern, "Young master, what's wrong with you?" "It's fine." Junhua shook his head and walked straight to his room, but he couldn't ignore the pain in his heart. "Is this love?" He clutched his hands to his chest. And a heart-piercing pain came from his chest. Luju and Liuyan looked at Junhua's lonely back, glanced at each other, obviously had a lot to say, but they didn't dare to say it. Because the current situation is caused by the two of them. If it weren't for their selfishness, it wouldn't have hurt Junhua to face today's predicament. In the evening, when Junhua learned that Baiming Qianyu asked Mrs. Shui to accompany him tonight, the bitterness spread in his heart, and there was a pain in his chest. And he looked at the delicious food on the table, but he didn't have a trace of appetite. Thinking of the lingering picture of the two, he put down his chopsticks, got up and walked to his room. "Young master." Liuyan looked at the untouched food and opened her mouth, wanting to say but not knowing what to say. Luju shook her head at her, signaling her not to say anything. After all, this level will have to be passed sooner or later. Ugh. Liuyan let out a long sigh. The next night, Baiming Qianyu called Mrs. Ru to accompany him, and Junhua sat in front of the window, listening to Luju and Liuyan in the courtyard talking about it, shaking his head and smiling bitterly. Obviously, this is what he was looking forward to. But when he heard that Baiming Qianyu had found other concubines to accompany him, he was so uncomfortable that he couldn't breathe. He really wanted to leave like this and never see Baiming Qianyu again. He rubbed his aching chest, intending to wait for the shadowless distraction that was secretly watching him, so he could escape from the Yao Dynasty and return to the Holy Dynasty. And the next day, Mrs. Ru returned to her small courtyard, thinking that the prince had not seen her last night, and left her outside, looking extremely gloomy. She has been in the palace for many years. How could she have been so angry? She was so angry that she waved her hand and knocked over the vase in front of her, so frightened that the maid outside the door trembled. "Shen Li, if you embarrass Mrs. Ru so much, then Mrs. Ru will kill you." She looked at the vase rack in front of her, as if she had seen Junhua. Her expression was hideous, and she wanted to kill him with her own hands. And she was not the only one who thought the same as her. And Mrs. Shui also looked gloomy, thinking about how to kill Shen Li to relieve the hatred in her heart. Junhua didn't know that someone hated him to the point of wanting to kill him, because recently, he had been observing and monitoring his shadow. After a few days of observation, he found that he was fascinated by the no-trace whereabouts, and it was difficult to find out the other party's work and rest time. In order to test whether Wu Ying could sleep at night, he deliberately got up in the middle of the night, and then left Wang Chunxuan, and was immediately stopped by the other party, and said respectfully, "Young Master Shen, where are you going so late?" Junhua was a little speechless. It seems that it is difficult to get rid of this shadowless. "I can't sleep. Can I get up and take a walk?" Junhua looked at the starry sky and found that the stars of the Yao Dynasty were not much different from the Holy Dynasty. "Yes, but now in the dead of night, everyone is asleep. Young Master Shen, you are wandering around the palace quietly, and your subordinates are afraid that young Master Shen will disturb other timid people. Wu Ying was neither humble nor arrogant, and he didn't say a word about Junhua's escape. Junhua turned around helplessly and walked towards his small courtyard. When he was about to walk into his room, he suddenly stopped, looked back at the shadowless behind him, and said in a consultative tone, "Anyway, the prince doesn't want to see me now. Can you open one eye and close one eye and let me go?" Wu Ying didn't expect Junhua to make this matter clear. He hesitated for a moment, and replied, "Young Master Shen, I know that I said these words a little too much, but I really don't want to see the prince so sad. Can you take the initiative to visit the prince once?" In recent days, he saw that prince didn't think about eating, and the whole person lost a lot of weight. And they were really uncomfortable in their eyes as subordinates. He really didn't want to see the prince who had been strategizing in the past become nervous for the sake of Junhua. And he was always in a panic. "The prince doesn't want to see me, so I won't go to ask for it." Junhua shook his head. He had been working hard in the past 7 or 8 days to get used to the existence of Baiming Qianyu, so he didn't want the habit he had cultivated so hard to destroy because of his soft heart. Wu Ying looked at Junhua, hesitated for a moment, and said, "Although the prince has asked his wife to accompany him every day recently, the prince has not seen them at all. The ladies only rested outside, and never set foot in the prince's room." Junhua was stunned, and it took a long time to come back to his senses. He suppressed the joy that rose in his heart, and asked uncertainty, "What did you say?" Since the prince met young Master Shen, he has never touched a woman. Shadowless is out at the moment. Anyway, I've said so much that I shouldn't have said, so why not say more? If the prince blames him, he will accept his fate. Junhua didn't know what his mood was at the moment. Obviously happy but a little sour. He grew so big, and for the first time he met someone who was not related by blood but was still so good to him. Obviously, they shouldn't have met. But they met for various reasons. Could it be that God has destined us to love each other? Junhua didn't know how he got back to his bed. He looked at the top of the mosquito net in a daze. And his heart was full of thoughts. Shouldn't I forget that I am Prince Junhua, and honestly accompany Baiming Qianyu as Shen Li? On the one hand, he is the Holy Dynasty that he grew up in. And on the other hand, he is sincere to his own Baiming Qianyu. He is swaying, and he doesn't know what choice to make. The sky was slightly bright, and Junhua, who had not slept all night, looked out the window with bloodshot eyes, and sighed. "That's it, anyway. Life is like this, why not choose the life I want to live?" As for his imperial brother, he should also accept the news of his death. He lay down and didn't want to get up until Luju came to report that Mrs. Ru had come to see him, and he got up from the bed. After he had washed up, he walked out of the room unhurriedly and walked towards the main hall. Mrs. Ru was already waiting in the main hall, and while she drank the tea in her hand, she commanded Luju and Liuyan to beat her legs and pinch her shoulders, just like a hostess. Luju and Liuyan didn't dare to resist, and honestly pinched her shoulders and her legs. Obviously, the strength of the two women is moderate, but how can anyone who wants to trouble them find an excuse? Only to hear Mrs. Ru scream, and the teacup in her hand fell to the ground. With a bang, the teacup was torn apart and the tea was spilled on the ground. "Are you going to murder Mrs. Ru? So hard, Mrs. Ru died." Mrs. Ru's voice was very loud. So frightened that Luju and Liuyan hurriedly came to Mrs. Ru, knelt down and kowtowed. "The slave didn't mean it, please punish Mrs. Ru." They know very well that Mrs. Ru is favored in recent days, and they don't dare to make trouble for Junhua. They keep kowtowing, begging Mrs. Ru not to embarrass them too much, otherwise Junhua, who loves short, will definitely offend Mrs. Ru for them. They don't want to implicate Junhua, which has fallen out of favor. Even if Luju and Liuyan banged their heads, Mrs. Ru didn't have any mercy. She deliberately rubbed her shoulders and called softly, "It hurts, it hurts. I'm afraid the bones are crushed." Junhua frowned. His expression was cold. "Luju and Liuyan, go out." The two women who kowtowed made a move. They looked at Junhua, who was protecting the shorts, and their hearts were slightly hot. Such a good master. Why was he bullied so much by these people? They wanted to help, but as slaves and maids, they didn't have the strength to help, so they had to stand up silently, bend over and want to exit the room. Mrs. Ru didn't let them go so easily, and scolded, "Bold. Do you want to get out of the whole body after pinching Mrs. Ru?" This frightened the second girl to her knees with a poof, and she trembled uncontrollably with fear. "What do you want?" Junhua was domineering, and Mrs. Ru was a little out of breath. "The waves in my heart are turbulent. I don't know why Junhua has such a strong momentum." Her voice unconsciously became much quieter. "This Liuyan pinched Mrs. Ru's shoulder, and she should be punished. I'll handle the matter of punishment, so I won't worry about Mrs. Ru." He looked at the second girl kneeling on the ground, and said with a cold face, "Luju, go and ask the best doctor. Let the doctor come and take a good look. How many bones have she crushed?" He deliberately bit these 4 words very hard, that is, to tell Mrs. Ru again, "If you want to play tricks in front of me, then I will accompany you to the end." He doesn't like to look for trouble, but he is not afraid of things either. Mrs. Ru's typical bullying and fear of hardness. Seeing that Junhua was imposing, she didn't dare to make trouble anymore, so she rubbed her soft and boneless waist, and looked shy. "Oh, recently. The prince just doesn't know how to pity the fragrance and cherish the jade, and he tosses me enough every night." If it hadn't been for what Wu Ying said to him last night, maybe Junhua would have believed Mrs. Ru's words. Now seeing Mrs. Ru deliberately rubbing her waist, he only felt pretentious, and a trace of impatience rose in his heart. "Mrs. Ru, haven't you slept outside these days?" Mrs. Ru looked stunned. How did he know that I slept outside at night? Immediately thinking that it was the prince and Shen Li who teamed up to bully her, her face became extremely terrifying and gloomy in an instant. Junhua ignored her eyes that wanted to eat people, and said indifferently, "If Mrs. Ru is just here to find trouble, please go. Wang Chunxuan does not welcome you." "Shen Li!" Mrs. Ru screamed with all her might. The sharp voice seemed to penetrate Junhua's eardrums. Junhua took a step back, his expression cold. "Luju and Liuyan, send off." The second girl couldn't help but admire Junhua's courage in her heart, and hurriedly got up and made a gesture of "Please, madam, please." Mrs. Ru looked resentful, and she couldn't wait to dismantle Junhua into 8 pieces to relieve the hatred in her heart. She stood up indignantly and smiled, like a begonia flower in spring, bright and moving. "Shen Li, I want to see if you have the last laugh or Mrs. Ru has the last laugh." With that, she chuckled and left. Looking at the back of Mrs. Ru leaving, a chill rose in Junhua's heart, and his soared eyebrows frowned unconsciously. This was the first time he felt threatened by a woman. But no matter what means the other party uses, he will not back down again. "Young master," Luju spoke, looking worried. When she saw Mrs. Ru smiling like a person just now, she couldn't help but worry about Junhua. "It's okay. Don't worry about me." Junhua smiled reassuringly, and then walked out of the main hall and walked towards the outside of the small courtyard. "Young master, where are you going?" Seeing this, Liuyan hurriedly followed the footsteps of Junhua. "You stay in the small courtyard, I have an important matter to tell the prince clearly." Junhua didn't look back, and walked towards the courtyard of Baiming Qianyu. Luju and Liuyan glanced at each other, and they both saw worry in each other's eyes, and they wanted to follow, but they didn't dare. In the end, I can only silently pray in my heart that Junhua can turn evil into good fortune every time he is in danger. The injuries on Baiming Qianyu's body have almost healed. And as long as he doesn't use force, there's almost no big problem. On this morning, he put on his official uniform and was about to go to the palace to find trouble with Baiming Xiao. But as soon as he went out, Leng Yi blocked his way, and said respectfully, "Prince, young Master Shen asks to see you." As soon as he heard that Ziqing want to see him, Baiming Qianyu subconsciously frowned and refused. No. Every time he sees Junhua, the person who is angry and hurt is always himself, and in order to prevent himself from being harmed, he chooses not to see it very wisely. "Prince." Leng Yi wants to talk and stops. He wanted to say, "Prince, everyone young Master Shen has taken the initiative to visit you, can you not be angry? Don't let young Master Shen be angry when the time comes, you are sulking again. I can't see it, why is there so much nonsense?" Baiming Qianyu's expression was slightly cold, and he looked impatient. Leng Yi shut up suddenly, turned around and was about to go to tell young Master Shen, saying that the prince didn't see him. But he saw that Junhua had already walked into the courtyard, and he hurriedly went to stop him. Junhua bypassed him directly and walked straight towards Baiming Qianyu. Baiming Qianyu looked at Junhua, who had not been seen for a few days, and a trace of longing rose in his heart, but he pretended to be indifferent and said, "What are you doing? Didn't you hear this prince say, I didn't want to see you?" Junhua glanced at the angry Baiming Qianyu. His attitude softened, and his tone was gentle. "Prince, I have something to say to you. Can you talk about it alone? This prince has nothing to say to you." Baiming Qianyu turned his head to Leng Yi and said, "Leng Yi, go prepare the carriage." "Prince." Leng Yi couldn't be anxious. And I wanted to shout, "Prince, everyone young Master Shen has taken the initiative to soften, can you give a step down?" Baiming Qianyu glanced at the mouthy Leng Yi, and was so frightened that Leng Yi didn't dare to speak again. Junhua sighed lightly, he stepped forward, hugged the gloomy Baiming Qianyu, and took the initiative to offer a kiss. Baiming Qianyu stretched out his hand to push Junhua away, but when he touched Junhua's soft lips, all his unhappiness was dispersed by this kiss. In particular, Junhua took the initiative to stretch out his tongue to open his closed teeth, and the heart that had been sore for a long time was finally relieved. Feeling the soft tongue of the other party, he bit it with his teeth angrily, and the blood instantly filled the entire mouth, and the pain made Junhua want to escape. Baiming Qianyu had already taken precautions, and clasped Junhua's head with both hands, so that Junhua had no way to retreat, and was forced to bear his slightly aggressive kiss. He wrapped his tongue around Junhua's tongue fiercely, sucking the kiss with the smell of blood, only to feel confused, and he wanted to press Junhua to the ground. Leng Yi had already withdrawn from the small courtyard with interest. He looked at the shadowless who appeared, and asked curiously, "What did you say to young Master Shen? Why did young Master Shen take the initiative to come to the prince today?" "I told young Master Shen about the prince's lack of favor with Mrs. Ru." Shadowless replied lightly. Leng Yi looked surprised. "Didn't the prince let us not tell young Master Shen? Why did you tell young Master Shen? What if the prince is to blame? Do you think the prince will still have the leisure to blame me now?" Leng Yi felt that there was nothing wrong with Wu Ying's words. And now that the prince was too late to be happy, how could he have the leisure to blame Wu Ying? As for going to see the emperor, I'm afraid it will have to wait until tomorrow. At dusk, Junhua was woken up by hunger. As soon as he got out of bed, his waist was hugged by the person behind him, and a slightly resentful voice sounded, You want to leave this prince again? Prince. I'm just hungry and want to go to the kitchen to find something to eat. Junhua broke the hand holding his waist and got up to dress. When you're hungry, tell me. I'll ask Lang Ning to bring dinner. As soon as he heard that Junhua was not trying to escape, this prince claimed to have turned into me in an instant. He hugged Junhua's waist again. And with force in his hands, he successfully dragged Junhua to the bed, and then used his hands and feet together, hugging the person in his arms tightly. Junhua didn't move. Baiming Qianyu hugged him, feeling all the breath of Baiming Qianyu sprayed on his neck, only to feel that his whole heart was warm. His expression was soft, and his tone was gentle like he had never been. Prince, I'm not leaving. I'll be with you for the rest of my life. Suddenly hearing Junhua's confession, Baiming Qianyu thought that he had auditory hallucinations, and his eyes showed a hint of uncertainty. What did you say? Junhua held Baiming Qianyu's hand tightly and said word by word, Prince. I won't leave. I will accompany you for the rest of my life. Really? Baiming Qianyu actually wanted to cry. He hugged the person in his arms tightly. And at this moment he really felt that Junhua belonged to him. Junhua let out a light, feeling the care of the people behind him. Junhua felt that it was the right choice to give up the identity of Prince Junhua. What about Fubai? Baiming Qianyu asked cautiously. He was really afraid that if he recovered his memory, he would come to rob his Junhua. My relationship with Fubai is really not what you think. Junhua explained. What's that relationship? Baiming Qianyu didn't believe Junhua's words. If they are not a couple, then why do they appear in similar places? Junhua hesitated. He didn't know whether to confess his identity to Baiming Qianyu. Seeing that he was silent, Baiming Qianyu's heart ached, but he didn't want to worry too much about this matter, otherwise he would be sad. As long as Junhua doesn't want to leave, then he can ignore the relationship between Junhua and Fubai. He changed the topic. Ziqing, aren't you hungry? If you want to eat, I'll let Lang Ning bring it over. Everything. Junhua is not picky about what to eat. Dinner didn't make the two of them wait too long. The two put on their clothes, sat at the table and chatted while eating, and the atmosphere was warm. It's just that what the two didn't expect was that this happiness didn't last long, and it was forcibly separated.